Welcome to Bed Crime Stories podcast. I'm your host, T. To all my bed crimers, hi, how are you? I hope you're having a great weekend. To anyone new here, a warm welcome. Let me just ask that after watching and or listening to the video, if you find you enjoyed it or learned something, do me a favor, smash the like button and consider subscribing. Now, let's dig in. November 13th. Will be the 1-year mark since 4 University of Idaho students, Ethan Chapin, Zana Cornoto, Kaylee Gonsalves, and Madison Mogan, lost their lives between the hours of 4 a.m. and 4:20 a.m. In that brief period, 4 precious human beings, some sleeping, some likely tired but still awake, were ambushed in the sanctity of their rental home by a cold, calculated monster whose heart was filled with hatred and rage and a plan that appears to have been many months in the making. I say the crime was one of rage because most perpetrators don't use a sharp object and get so up close and personal with their victims, especially victims they are not intimately involved with. Only a person who wants to feel their crime, viscerally experience the act of using a sharp object on flesh, would likely opt for a K-bar instead of another weapon. The 4 victims had all been out having fun on the night of Saturday, November 12th, and into the early morning hours of Sunday, November 13th. Everyone who spent the night at 1122 King Road that weekend arrived home by 1:45 a.m. Back when this shocking crime first occurred, it rocked the entire community of Moscow, Idaho. The crime spoke to some of our deepest fears. Being home at night, asleep, and being attacked randomly without warning. The quaint college town of about 26,000 residents and the student neighborhood around 1122 King Road had previously been viewed as safe, innocent, laughter and music-filled, where fresh-faced students could roam day or night without fear. Everything changed overnight after that 20-minute rampage. 20 minutes was all that it took to destroy countless lives and to terrorize a city. And when the sun rose on Sunday, November 13th, and cast its light inside that house, the full carnage of what went down had to have been like a massive gut punch to every fiber of the 2 survivors' beings. There were rumors that one of them fainted. If anything would make you faint, it would be those sights. It had to have been just as upsetting to the friends they called over that morning, and the police officers who would only be notified of the crime at 11:58 a.m., 2 minutes before noon, where wine used to flow as the young women enjoyed the fruits of college life during their many parties and gatherings. Blood now streamed, so much so that it had seeped outside the walls of the house. It was a shocking, almost unbelievable sight to behold. Anyone who had the misfortune of seeing those things will probably suffer from PTSD for a lifetime. You can't unsee stuff like that. A neighbor noticed the home's front door open early that morning, which was odd because it had been a chilly, somewhat foggy night with frost on the ground. I've often wondered who opened that door. At first, I was convinced it had to have been the perpetrator making a swift exit. Who else would leave the door open when it was so cold? We later learned that the investigators theorized that the perpetrator left via the rear sliding glass doors, which made more sense. Entering and exiting in the back of the house meant less of a chance of being seen. My latest conclusion about that front door being open is that one of the survivors, likely Bethany Funk, opened it that morning to allow fresh air in. People who've experienced what a lot of blood smells like say it's an overwhelming, unpleasant odor. Thus, I believe the survivors were trying to dilute that scent. Unbeknownst to anyone near 1122 King Road that day, the now alleged perpetrator, Bryan Kohberger, took a look-see at the crime scene house around 9 a.m. Sunday morning. The police based this on the fact that Kohberger's phone pinged off a cell tower in the area that morning. Many detectives say that it's not unusual for a perpetrator to turn up at the crime scene after the fact to see what's going on and to enjoy the sick spectacle. And when we found out that 2 of the home's inhabitants survived the carnage, we were equally shocked. Why did this machine of a killer spare their lives? We wondered if maybe he didn't realize they were inside the home. But then we found out that survivor Dylan Mortensen awoke around 4 a.m. after hearing noises. She had actually cracked her bedroom door open 3 times, and upon the 3rd time, inadvertently caught sight of a stranger, a man she didn't recognize, whom she later described as being 5 foot 10 inches tall or taller, not very muscular, but athletically built, dressed in black, with bushy eyebrows and a mask over his nose and mouth, walking past her and then out the kitchen door. One can only imagine the terror that must have filled her body as she tried to remain perfectly still and silent. She described it as standing frozen and being in shock. Without Dylan's description of this scary person, this crime may not have been solved when it was. Her details were spot on and gave the police something to work with. Only recently have we learned that according to jurors who participated in the grand jury, that the 2 survivors were allegedly texting each other as the crime took place and throughout the dark night. And this is why most of us are still baffled as to why it took them 7 hours before anyone dialed 911. How was it possible for them to remain in their rooms and maybe to even sleep after hearing what sounded like Kaylee up on the 3rd floor, playing with her dog, and then a short time later, hearing someone who sounded like Kaylee exclaiming something to the effect of, "There's someone here." And then minutes later, after hearing Xana crying and or whimpering, and a male voice declaring, "It's okay, I'm going to help you." We know that these sounds, along with the barking of Kaylee's dog Murphy and a thump, were loud enough to be picked up by a security camera less than 50 feet from Xana's bedroom at 4:17 a.m. Dylan said she locked her own bedroom door after the man walked out. Thus we know she had to have been terrified. So why not dial 911 ASAP? Did she text Bethany and say, "Lock your door and don't come out"? This is perhaps the greatest mystery of all in this case. It wasn't long before reporters arrived in news vans and satellite trucks and swarmed the streets around 1122 King Road. TV producers crowded into the Corner Club bar, chatting up students, trying to get a scoop. Nancy Grace turned up right outside the crime scene house. Then came the sleuths, TikTokers, and true crime podcasters and YouTubers, all descended on little old Moscow, Idaho. People were scouring the social media accounts of the 4 students looking for clues. In the early days, the Moscow police were saying that this was likely a targeted crime with no further threat to the public. The police said they came to this conclusion because of evidence found at the scene and because 2 people in the house survived. They didn't say what evidence it was that led them to this conclusion. Could it have been the leather sheath that was found on the bed next to Maddie Mogan's right side? Did that sheath being next to Maddie make the investigators believe that the attack was targeted and that the primary target was indeed Maddie? We know a Vans tennis shoe print was also found on the floor just outside of Dylan Mortensen's door. I still wonder if Dylan maybe had a greater interaction with the mystery man than we currently know of. At one point, I heard Steve Gonsalves say that Dylan maybe stepped outside the bedroom at one point. That implies more than just a peek out of a cracked door. By day 4, Police Chief Jason Fry adjusted the official line to, quote, "We cannot say that there is no threat to the community," end quote. This is when residents really got scared. Some stopped leaving the house. Some began driving to places they normally would have walked to. Some sorority houses hired security to keep watch. Some security sisters all slept in the same room. The residents of Moscow were told to lock their doors, walk in pairs, and be alert. Chief Fry also told CNN that there could potentially be more than one person responsible for the crime. It's likely they said this because to have 4 people done in that relatively short amount of time seemed almost impossible at first glance. Some people still can't fathom that one person could do that to 4 people within 15 to 20 minutes tops, but they fail to look at how much damage can be done with one targeted gash to, say, the neck or the heart. There was also talk of this being a crime of passion. Hearing that it might be a crime of passion led many to speculate that maybe Kaylee's ex-boyfriend, Jack DeCur, was responsible. This theory seemed to be supported by the many unanswered calls made by both Kaylee and Maddie's cell phones to Jack. But eventually the police had to admit that they could not really reassure the community that they were safe because they had no clue who committed the crime or why the person committed the crime. University of Idaho students fled the campus, and some parents said they would not send their children back until the case was solved. Jack DeCur, who was cleared early on by the police, willingly subjected himself to removing his shirt so that Kaylee's father could inspect him, and I believe he also was subjected to a polygraph. Not only was Jack DeCur under the spotlight and having myriad YouTube videos made about him, other guys within the girls' circle were being raked over the coals. Once the Twitch livestream video from the grub truck was released, the guy who seemed to be hovering near Kaylee and Maddie in the back, remember the guy with the hoodie over his head? Well, he found himself being scrutinized as well. His name is Jack Showalter, and when people discovered he was a hunter of big game and saw photos of him standing next to large fallen prey, they were certain that he had to be the perpetrator. When we watched as Kaylee and Maddie took off running from the grub truck, presumably to a waiting car, leaving this shadowy figure on the sidewalk to walk home alone in the dark, it was speculated that perhaps Showalter was a jilted guy who then went on foot to 1122 King Road to punish the 2 young women in a big way. Maybe he'd been with them at the corner club bar and had plied them with free drinks, only to be callously dumped at the end of the night. You never know when a guy who's expecting some candy, wink wink, after paying for drinks is gonna go postal on the women who he thinks took him for a ride. Madison Mogen's boyfriend, Jake Schreiger, also faced scrutiny, as did any number of male neighbors who dared to put themselves out there in front of microphones and cameras to talk about what, if anything, they heard or saw on the night of the crime. Poor Jeremy Reagan, a law student who lived in the victim's neighborhood, became a target when he gave a handful of interviews about the crime. YouTubers were studying his body language and his facial expressions. One person observed that Reagan's behavior was similar to Ted Bundy's when he would talk about his crimes. Soon, Reagan's online presence was being combed through with a fine-tooth, comb. A bandage seen on his right hand was seen as incriminating. How did he cut himself? Reagan even volunteered to take a DNA test, but the police had never named him a suspect. It turned out he really just wanted to help. And then there was the sharp object-wielding cook, neighbor Enon Harsh, who lived next door in the yellow and brick apartment building. He came forward in early December to say that he returned home from his job around 1:30 a.m. on November 13th and later heard someone yell. He said he dozed off around 4 a.m. and assumed it was a party sound coming from 1122 King Road. He said he didn't think anything of it until he heard about the crime. Harsh also said he spotted an unfamiliar black luxury SUV at 1:30 a.m. parked a few spaces from the girl's home which he reported to police a few days after the crime. Harsh immediately became the next potential suspect. This was because he seemed odd and even laughed when talking about the crime. He also talked about seeing the girls have a party at their house and taking an open bottle of wine over to them. He fit the bill of the type of person criminal profilers were saying likely committed the crime. Someone with a very regimented lifestyle, someone who would seem odd if you interacted with him, someone who was perhaps an involuntary celibate or incel, basically a guy who loathes pretty young women because they overwhelmingly reject him, deny him of physical intimacy, and even invitations to their parties. But Harsh seemed to enjoy the attention and even posted a YouTube video of himself chopping with a sharp object. This maybe was a dark joke for him, but to many of us it came off as chilling. There was also talk of Kaylee having a stalker, although no one seemed able to pinpoint who that might be, and her family said she never mentioned this to them. She was so beautiful that it's easy to buy into her having a stalker. In fact, all of the girls living at 1122 King Road were lovely, popular, and good students, thus it would be easy to believe that any one of them could have had a stalker. Many speculated that the nearby fraternity that Ethan Chapin belonged to was somehow involved. Several members of the fraternity house were singled out, and there were rumors that Ethan maybe had a fight with someone at a party there before returning back to Xana's shared home on King Road that night. Some speculated about the sexuality of some frat members and their desire to keep their authentic selves a secret. It got really wild at this point on Reddit and 4chan. One less than ethical TikToker claimed a history professor from the university was responsible for the crime, a truly bizarre and wholly unsubstantiated theory. People living in Moscow finally got sick of the intrusion and put signs out begging journalists to leave them alone. There were also theories that perhaps a recently deceased Afghanistan veteran was involved. This was because of the K-bar sheath left at the scene. That particular sharp object is used by many in the military. Facebook groups dedicated to the crime had chat threads where members were trying to build a case that Kohberger didn't do it, and instead a Mexican drug cartel was involved. One key piece of evidence some of them cited was an image from Google Maps that showed shoes hanging from power lines in the victim's neighborhood. Some of these sleuths claimed that it was a sign of drug activity, although if you Google it, it's also known to be a memorial for someone who has died. Speaking of sharp objects, the police were sort of cagey in the beginning about the weapon used in the crime. They described it as a fixed blade, and they asked local businesses to come forward if they had evidence that such an object had been purchased. Rumors of a skinned dog found 3 weeks before the crime seemed to suggest that perhaps the same person who harmed that adorable pooch likely harmed the students. And once we heard about the dog, it seemed like a possibility that whoever did in the students was likely either an established serialist or a serialist in the making. We know that serialists are tied to early behaviors of starting fires, wetting the bed, and hurting animals, and then they gradually work their way up to doing in people. And being able to harm 4 people with a sharp object in 15 to 20 minutes made it seem like the perpetrator had to have done this before. What serialist harms more than one victim during their first crime of this nature? Well, actually, Dennis Rader did. He was caught unaware when he entered the Otero home and found not 1 but 4 people home, including the man of the house, Mr. Otero. Rader had to think fast on his feet to gain control in that situation. Is that what happened at 1122 King Road? Did the perpetrator plan to only harm 1 of the females, most likely Maddie, and then find himself having to harm Kaylee because she was sleeping in the bed with Maddie, and then having to also harm both Ethan and Xana when he inadvertently ran into Xana maybe, who had just received a food delivery at 4 a.m. and maybe was out of her room and back and forth to the kitchen when the perpetrator came down the stairs from the 3rd floor? We can only speculate. The police began urging the public to come forward with information and any security camera footage. Thankfully, a clerk at a gas station took the time to meticulously watch the station's security footage from the night of the crime. She's the person who spotted a white sedan hightailing it down the road. An agent who specializes in identifying the makes and models and years of vehicles proclaimed that a white Hyundai Elantra from the years 2011 to 2013 might be involved. Thus, in late November, the Moscow police asked other authorities, including law enforcement in Pullman, Washington, to keep an eye out for white Hyundai Elantra. And on November 29th, a Washington State University police officer searched cars that matched the description at the university and found one registered to Bryan Kohberger. A candlelight vigil was then held on November 30th. Little did the attendees know that in exactly 1 month, a suspect would be arrested. Ethan Chapin's brave mom, Stacy, spoke at the vigil. She urged people to make sure that they spend as much time as possible with their loved ones because time is precious and it's something you can't get back. This is a message we should all have tattooed on our brains. No wiser words have ever been spoken. Even in her grief, Stacy Chapin was trying to help other people. It was at this vigil that Kaylee's father, Steve Gonsalves, let it slip that Kaylee and Maddie died together in the same room and bed. The police maybe wanted to keep that detail under wraps. It wasn't until December 7th that the police announced to the public that they were looking to speak to the driver of a white 2011 to 2013 Hyundai Elantra that was seen in the immediate area of the victim's house on the night of the crime. We later found out that Kohberger drove a 2015 white Elantra. That's when the authorities altered the description and said it could be a 2011 to 2016 Hyundai Elantra. On December 15th, Bryan Kohberger, a person none of us had heard of, was driving home for the holidays to Pennsylvania with his father in a white Elantra and was stopped by the Indiana police for 2 traffic violations. They were stopped once for speeding and then 9 minutes later again for following another vehicle too closely. None of us in the public had any clue about Kohberger at this point. We didn't know that the possible perpetrator was on his way to the East Coast with his dad in tow. I still say those 2 traffic stops within 9 minutes of each other were no coincidence. I mean, come on. And when Kohberger was asked where he was driving to, he said a Thai restaurant. It was either Thai or Indian at the next exit. I believe he was terrified at that point. He didn't want to admit, or rather leak, that he was driving all the way to Pennsylvania. I could be wrong though. Maybe he's just someone who takes a question like that literally, as in, where are you headed right this minute? And of course his father, who understood what the officer was asking about, jumped in and said they were going to Pennsylvania. On December 27th, 2022, the authorities found DNA on the leather sheath that had been left on Maddie's bed. That same day, they recovered trash from Kohberger's parents' house. A lab soon discovered that the DNA from the trash was the DNA of the father of the male person who left DNA on the snap of the leather sheath. The police must have been so busy during this period looking at DNA results, scouring Kohberger's cell phone records, looking at surveillance camera footage from places in Moscow, Idaho, and Pullman, Washington, where Kohberger was in the criminology program as a PhD candidate and a teaching assistant. Just 3 days later, Bryan Kohberger was arrested in the early morning hours of December 30th. Happy New Year, not so much for the Kohberger family. A day before Bryan Kohberger was arrested for the crime, On December 30th, Moscow Police Chief James Fry said that they would be bringing in a professional cleaning crew to the crime scene house. He said this was because of the biohazards the crime scenes posed and because of the chemicals the investigators had used. Most retired cops on YouTube were flabbergasted that the authorities were planning to destroy any remaining evidence after such a short time. This was a very complicated crime scene. You've got 4 victims, so you'd expect the authorities to hold on to it for as long as possible, right up to the trial and perhaps even through the trial. And that is what ended up happening, at least for now. Despite the prosecutors and the defense team saying they're done with the house remains standing. And the FBI has been there this week gathering further evidence and measuring all the spaces. And once Kohberger was arrested, online sleuths did find fascinating remnants from his past online. It is widely believed that he had posted on an online forum for sufferers of visual snow syndrome, an affliction that makes your vision blurry like an old-fashioned TV set. This is when it became apparent that if Kohberger was really posting those posts, then he was someone who had clearly suffered from depression in his past and from a serious sense of alienation. Some of Kohberger's friends from middle school and high school then came forward to say how he'd been mercilessly bullied in school and how he would always go for the pretty blonde cheerleader types who inevitably rejected him. After he lost more than 100 pounds and even apparently had a tummy tuck, Kohberger felt his luck with the ladies would change. It didn't. It must have felt like nothing I ever do makes me appealing to the girls that I find appealing. What's wrong with me? Or what's wrong with them? Kohberger also posted a questionnaire online as part of his master's program at DeSales University to ask convicted felons about their experiences when planning their crimes and carrying them out. Was he trawling for research for his own planned crime? And this is when the incel theories popped up, that maybe Kohberger committed, allegedly, this heartless crime to get revenge on one of the girls who maybe had rejected him. We know that he slid into Maddie Mogen's Instagram DMs several times, and he never heard back from her. Could this have finally made him crack? He was also having trouble getting along with his fellow students and colleagues at WSU by that time. His verbal altercations with Professor John Schneider led him to be told he needed to shape up, and eventually he did lose his TA position, which he probably needed to pay for his life in Pullman. There was also much speculation about the vet who suffered PTSD for 16 years before a fatal incident near the WSU campus. That incident occurred on December 15th, 2022, the same day Kohberger and his dad were pulled over in Indiana. Some people felt that the vet, Brent Lee Kopacka, was somehow involved in the crime in Moscow, Idaho. Kopacka threatened to do in his roommates, and he had a weapon. So a SWAT team descended, and when Kopacka fired, and when negotiations failed, a SWAT team member took him out. I have never bought into there being any connection between Kopacka and Kohberger, other than maybe they knew each other from the WSU campus, where I believe Kopacka was a security guard. All in all, it's been a very long year in this case, full of so much speculation and so many theories, and a trial date still has not been set. For the victims' families, this has been like a life sentence of being in limbo, waiting for answers and justice. Let's hope that when the clock strikes midnight on December 31st of this year, it will pave the way for a new year in which the families get their answers and that long-awaited justice they and the victims so deserve. Until the next time on Bed Crime Stories.